August 12, 2015. California State Prison, Sacramento. Hugo Yogi Pinell had survived 43 years in solitary confinement, longer than any inmate in California history. He'd outlasted brutal guards, assassination attempts, and decades of sensory deprivation in an 8 by 10-foot concrete tomb. After nearly half a century, a landmark lawsuit finally freed him to general population. 5 days later he was dead, stabbed on the exercise yard by fellow inmates. This is the story of America's most notorious isolation unit, a place designed not just to punish, but to psychologically destroy, where the U.S. government conducted what experts call an experiment in human endurance. You're about to discover how California built a machine that breaks minds, how prisoners organized the largest hunger strike in American history, and how a legal settlement that promised freedom became a death sentence. But what you won't expect is this: the men who sued the state and won their freedom. 4 of them were leaders of rival prison gangs who'd spent years trying to kill each other. How they united would change everything, and nearly cost them everything. Pelican Bay State Prison, Crescent City, California. 2 miles from the Pacific Ocean, just south of the Oregon border. When it opened in 1989, corrections officials promised it would be different. Cleaner. More controlled. State-of-the-art. What they built became a blueprint for psychological torture. The Security Housing Unit, the SHU, takes up half the prison. An X-shaped cluster of buildings. 1,056 solitary confinement cells organized into 132 pods of 8 cells each. Each cell, 8 feet by 10 feet. 80 square feet. About the size of a parking space. Court documents describe what's inside. A concrete ledge with a thin foam pad for a bed. A steel toilet sink combination. 2 concrete cubes serving as desk and chair. No windows. The cell door isn't bars, it's perforated steel. Guards can see in perfectly. Prisoners can barely see out. According to testimony from former inmates, you live in that space 22.5 to 24 hours every single day. You eat in that cell. Sleep in that cell. Defecate in that cell. For years. For decades. By 2011, according to legal filings in Ashker versus Governor of California, the numbers were staggering. More than 500 men had been in the Pelican Bay SHU for over 10 years. 78 had been there for more than 20 years. Not for crimes committed in prison. Not for violence or rule violations. For alleged gang affiliation. Here's how it worked, according to the class action complaint. Prison officials validated you as a gang member based on circumstantial evidence. Reading materials. Even artwork. Testimony reveals that validation could come from confidential informants, prisoners who'd never face cross-examination. Information you'd never see. Once validated, you went to the SHU. Indefinitely. No end date. The official policy, you stay until you debrief, meaning snitch on other gang members, or you die. Former inmates describe it as choosing between death on the yard as a snitch, or death by isolation in a concrete box. But the real danger wasn't the concrete. It was what happened inside your mind. In 2003, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Craig Haney conducted a study that would become central to the lawsuit against California. He randomly selected 100 inmates at Pelican Bay SHU and documented their psychological condition. The findings were devastating. 91% reported severe anxiety and nervousness. 84% suffered chronic lethargy. 84% had difficulty sleeping. 70% felt they were on the verge of an emotional breakdown. 68% experienced heart palpitations. 86% reported oversensitivity to external stimuli. 83% experienced social withdrawal. 77% suffered chronic depression. Dr. Haney's expert testimony stated that inmates developed what he called SHU syndrome, a distinct psychiatric condition caused by extreme isolation. Haney compared these symptoms to prisoners of war, to hostages, to sensory deprivation experiments from the Cold War. The United Nations Commission Against Torture reviewed these findings in 2014. Their conclusion? Solitary confinement beyond 15 days can constitute torture under international law. At Pelican Bay, men were doing 20 years. If you want to understand how California's prison system became America's most controversial, hit that subscribe button. This story goes deeper than anyone imagined. Inside the SHU, 3 unwritten rules controlled everything. Break them and you don't survive. Former inmates consistently report the same survival mechanism: emotional shutdown. In a 2017 follow-up study conducted by Stanford Law School, researchers interviewed dozens of men who'd spent 10+ years in Pelican Bay SHU. They described their psychological state using words like desolate, stale, like a robot. One interviewee, whose testimony appears in court records, explained, "You can't let them see they're breaking you. You can't let the guards know. You can't even admit it to yourself." Prison psychologist Dr. Terry Kupers documented what he called SHU post-release syndrome, symptoms that persisted long after release. Massive anxiety in crowds. Hyper-awareness of every sound. A compulsive need to retreat to small, enclosed spaces. The debriefing policy created a nightmare of paranoia. According to legal testimony, the only way out of the SHU was to provide information on other gang members. But here's the trap. You didn't just have to tell the truth. You had to tell information that led to someone else's validation and SHU placement. Multiple inmates described the system in sworn declarations. Desperate men were making up information to escape solitary. False accusations multiplied. Anyone could be your enemy. Todd Ashker, who'd later lead the hunger strikes, spent 27 years in isolation. In legal filings, he stated that the debriefing policy forces prisoners to lie, to falsely implicate others, in order to gain their own release. But this wasn't just punishment. Multiple experts testified this was something else entirely. In the Madrid versus Gomez case from 1995, federal courts examined early conditions at Pelican Bay. The court found the prison was in a mental health crisis. Expert witness testimony revealed guards at Pelican Bay had established what the court called a culture of violence. In April 1992, guards took an inmate named Von Dorch, who was suffering from severe mental illness and had smeared himself with feces, to be cleaned. According to court testimony, 5 to 6 guards subjected Dorch to a bath in scalding water while he was handcuffed. He suffered 2nd and 3rd degree burns over much of his body. CBS's 60 Minutes covered the case in September 1993. The segment showed the horrific injuries. Guards had boiled a man alive. Court records also document what guards called gladiator fights, intentionally releasing 2 prisoners from enemy gangs into the same space, then shooting at them after they started fighting. This was the system. And for decades, it was completely legal. What most people don't know is that Pelican Bay SHU wasn't just harsh punishment. Psychologists and legal experts who studied the facility came to a darker conclusion. Every element of the SHU was engineered for maximum psychological damage. The perforated steel doors weren't just security, they created asymmetrical power. Guards could watch you constantly. You couldn't see them. Former inmates described the feeling of being on display, always observed, never private. The concrete walls and ceilings weren't just cheap construction. Acoustics experts who testified in Madrid versus Gomez noted that sound reverberates differently in solid concrete. Every noise, footsteps, doors, shouts, becomes amplified, distorted, impossible to locate. One inmate's testimony described it: "You hear things but you can't tell if it's next door or 3 cells down or in your head. Once per day, if you're lucky, you get out of your cell. Not to a yard. To what prisoners call the dog run." According to descriptions in legal documents, it's a concrete box approximately 8 feet by 20 feet with a small mesh opening at the top. You're alone. You can take about 4 steps in one direction, 10 in the other, then you're turning around. Former inmate testimony from the Ashker case describes what that hour does to you. You're pacing like an animal. The walls close in. Sometimes I'd rather stay in the cell than go to that cage. But it's what you can't do that destroys you. Court records document the restrictions. No contact visits with family, ever. No phone calls. No group programming. No educational opportunities. No job training. No touching another human being. Inmates went decades, literally decades, without physical contact with another person. No handshake. No hug from a family member. Nothing. Dr. Craig Haney's expert report, filed in the Ashker case, explained what happens to the human brain under these conditions. Social contact isn't a luxury, it's a fundamental human need. Numerous psychological studies demonstrate that prolonged isolation causes structural changes in the brain. The areas responsible for processing social information, emotional regulation, and spatial awareness begin to deteriorate. Haney documented prisoners who developed vivid hallucinations, visual, auditory, tactile, paranoid delusions, dissociative episodes, losing track of time and reality, uncontrollable rage followed by catatonic withdrawal, suicidal ideation. And here's what made it worse. Inmates with pre-existing mental illness, neurological differences, or trauma histories showed even more severe breakdown. Analysis revealed that those vulnerable populations were statistically more likely to be sent to SHU in the first place. If you acted out from the psychological stress, you got more time in isolation. If you harmed yourself, you went to administrative segregation, another form of solitary. If you became psychotic, medical treatment was minimal. Multiple expert witnesses testified that the system was designed to create the very behaviors it claimed to prevent. Yet in the most isolated, controlled, surveilled prison unit in America, something impossible began to happen. 4 men, members of 4 rival gangs who'd spent years trying to have each other killed, started talking. Todd Ashker arrived in Pelican Bay's SHU in the 1980s, validated as a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, one of the most violent white supremacist prison gangs in America. By 2006, according to court filings, he'd been in solitary for over 2 decades. No end in sight. The California Department of Corrections considered him one of the most dangerous inmates in the system, not because of violence in prison, but because of alleged influence over gang operations. Arturo Castellanos came from the streets of South Los Angeles. Validated as connected to Florencia 13, a street gang with ties to the Mexican mafia. Legal documents show he was placed in the SHU's short corridor, a special section with fewer cells reserved for what guards called the highest-ranking gang members. Ronnie Dewberry, validated as Black Guerrilla Family, the same gang George Jackson co-founded before his death in 1971. Antonio Guillen, Northern California gang member, Nuestra Familia. In 2006, prison officials reorganized the SHU. They thought they were being smart, put the gang leaders together in one pod so they could watch them more closely. What they actually did was put 4 intelligent, resourceful men in adjacent cells where they could communicate. In a 2014 NPR Fresh Air interview, journalist Ben Wallace-Wells, who covered the strikes, explained what happened next. These 4 men were in their late 40s and early 50s. They had decades in the same pod. And they had nothing to do but talk. This is where the story takes an unbelievable turn. Leave a comment if you can guess what these gang rivals started talking about first. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't prison politics. The answer is something far more human. According to testimony and interviews with the strike leaders, they started talking about their families, their kids, what they'd missed, birthdays, graduations, funerals they couldn't attend. Ashker and the others formed what they called a revolutionary book club, shouting discussions about books between cells. They read about revolutionary movements, civil rights, prison reform. And slowly, something clicked. In statements later published, Ashker described the realization: the racial divisions between them were artificial. Guards had coached these divisions along for decades to maintain control. They weren't white versus black versus brown. They were prisoners, all suffering the same torture. In 2009, Ashker and another SHU prisoner, Danny Troxel, filed a pro-SE lawsuit, meaning they represented themselves, challenging California's gang validation policies. The suit argued that keeping men in indefinite solitary based on alleged gang ties, with little evidence and no real review process, violated the Constitution. By 2011, the Short Corridor Collective had drafted what they called the 5 core demands. Eliminate group punishments for individual rule violations. Abolish the debriefing policy and modify gang validation criteria. Comply with UN recommendations regarding long-term solitary confinement. Provide adequate and nutritious food. Expand constructive programming for indefinite SHU inmates. Simple requests. Warm clothing. A handball for the exercise yard. 1 phone call per week. The ability to take educational courses. Things that federal supermax prisons in other states already allowed. On July 1, 2011, over 1,000 prisoners at Pelican Bay stopped eating. Within a week, the strike spread to 6,600 prisoners across 13 California facilities. This had never happened before. Rival gangs, Black, White, Hispanic, Northern California, Southern California groups that had killed each other for decades, all refusing food together. On July 20th, after nearly 3 weeks, California Department of Corrections Secretary Matthew Cate met with the strike leaders. For the first time in Pelican Bay history, prisoners and officials sat at a table with no bulletproof glass between them. The CDCR promised reforms. The strike ended. The promised changes never came. In September 2011, prisoners resumed the hunger strike. Again, officials made promises. Again, they failed to deliver. In May 2012, the Center for Constitutional Rights, Legal Services for Prisoners with Children, and other organizations joined Ashker's case. They filed an amended class action complaint on behalf of 10 named plaintiffs who'd been in the SHU for 11 to 22 years. The complaint stated that California's uniquely harsh regime of prolonged solitary confinement at Pelican Bay is inhumane and debilitating and violates both due process and the 8th Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. July 8, 2013. Over 30,000 prisoners across California refused meals. It was the largest prison hunger strike in American history. This time, it lasted 60 days. Men were hospitalized. Organs began failing. A federal judge authorized force feeding. Finally, California legislators Lonnie Hancock and Tom Amiano promised public hearings. The strike ended. While Ashker and the others fought in court, one man had already broken every record for time in isolation. Hugo Yogi Pinell, one of the San Quentin Six, involved in the 1971 prison uprising that left George Jackson dead. Pinell was convicted of slashing the throats of 2 guards during the escape attempt. Both survived. He was given a 3rd life sentence. But that violence earned him something else: 43 years in California's isolation units. 23 of those years at Pelican Bay SHU. Witness statements from fellow prisoners describe the toll. Pinell was beaten regularly by guards. He survived multiple assassination attempts, including a smuggled zip gun in 1981, 2 stabbings, and a homemade bomb thrown at his cell. He went decades without touching his family. His daughter, Allegra Taylor, visited him every weekend after his 2014 transfer from Pelican Bay. She testified in legal filings about watching her father have to put his hands through a slot to be uncuffed while she sat separated by glass. In 1989, the same year Pelican Bay opened, 27-year-old Armando Flores was transferred there directly from another prison. He'd never been in general population. In interviews later published by San Quentin News, Flores described his first days. "I didn't understand the dynamics. I was young. I was scared." He described the conditions. "It rains a lot up there and it's always cold. When I entered, most of the guards were white men, mountain people. They were aggressive." Flores spent the next 26 years in an 8x10 cell. He recalled the exercise routine. "I could take about 4 steps one way and 10 steps the other way and I'd already be turning." 26 years pacing in a concrete box. Johnny Barra, 41 years old when he was finally released, spent 20 years in Pelican Bay SHU. Like Flores, he'd never experienced general prison population. In testimony published by San Quentin News, Barra described the catch-22. "Prison officials told me the 2 ways to get out were to debrief, become an informant, or die. The third way, parole, was unlikely for a lifer in the SHU." He filed dozens of administrative appeals. All denied. The courts deferred to prison officials. August 2015. After years of litigation, California agreed to a landmark settlement. Under the terms in Ashker versus Governor of California, California would end indefinite solitary confinement. No more SHU placement based solely on gang affiliation. Those who'd been in SHU for 10+ years would be reviewed for release. A cap on the length of time anyone could spend in Pelican Bay SHU. A step-down program to ease the transition. It was historic. Advocates called it a victory that would transform American corrections. California's SHUs dropped by 80% in population. Hundreds of men who'd spent decades in isolation were moving to general population or transitional housing. But no one had fully considered what happens when you take someone who's been isolated for 20, 30, 40 years and suddenly put them in a crowded prison yard. Hugo Pinell had been moved from Pelican Bay to California State Prison, Sacramento in 2014 as part of the settlement process. For 43 years, he'd been kept in isolation partly for his own protection. The Aryan Brotherhood had wanted him dead since the 1970s. Prison officials knew this. It was in his file. On August 12, 2015, 5 days after his release to general population, Hugo Pinell walked onto the exercise yard. At approximately 12:55 p.m., 2 inmates attacked him. Both were later identified as Aryan Brotherhood associates, Jason Beaver, Weaver and Waylon Pitchford. Pinell was stabbed multiple times. The attack sparked a riot involving 70 inmates. Guards fired 160 rounds of less than lethal ammunition and 3 warning shots from an M14 rifle. Hugo Pinell was pronounced dead at 1:22 p.m. The date wasn't random. August 12th was the 39th anniversary of Pinell's conviction as one of the San Quentin Six. In 2024 federal trial testimony, defense lawyers presented evidence that prison officials may have facilitated the murder. An Aryan Brotherhood member named Gary Joe Littrell had been released from Pelican Bay SHU in 2015 under the same settlement, and allegedly spread the word that the hit on Pinell was still active. A wrongful death lawsuit filed by Pinell's daughter alleged that CDCR knew he was targeted and put him in harm's way anyway. The suit was later dismissed on technical grounds. But Pinell wasn't the only one affected by the sudden transitions. Stanford Law School's 2017 follow-up study interviewed dozens of Ashker class members who'd been released from long-term SHU. Researchers documented what Dr. Terry Kupers called SHU post-release syndrome. Overwhelming anxiety in crowds. Inability to tolerate noise or sudden movements. Compulsive need to return to small enclosed spaces. Severe depression. Difficulty reconnecting with family. Persistent paranoia. One interviewee described his first meal in the general population dining hall after 26 years in isolation. "I couldn't do it. Too many people. Too much noise. I took my tray back to my cell." The lawsuit that freed them didn't prepare them for freedom. Decades of systematic psychological damage couldn't be undone with a court order. Here's the twist nobody expected. The settlement proved that California officials knew all along that indefinite solitary confinement wasn't about safety. It was about control. If these men were truly too dangerous for human contact, so dangerous they needed decades in isolation, then releasing them suddenly to general population would be reckless. But if they weren't that dangerous, if the gang validations were based on weak evidence, if the indefinite isolation was unnecessary, then California had tortured hundreds of men for no legitimate purpose. California chose both. They kept men isolated for decades, claiming necessity. Then they released them abruptly when a court forced their hand. Hugo Pinell paid the price. As of 2025, California still uses solitary confinement, though in smaller numbers and with more restrictions. Todd Ashker, Arturo Castellanos, and the other hunger strike leaders are out of long-term isolation. They continue to advocate for further prison reform. The 2015 settlement is still being monitored. Violations are still being litigated. But the men who spent decades in Pelican Bay's SHU? Most are still in prison. Still struggling with the psychological damage. Still trapped in the aftermath of America's experiment with isolation. If you made it this far, hit that like button and subscribe. We're exposing the prison stories the system doesn't want you to know. Pelican Bay's story isn't just about one prison or one lawsuit. It's about what happens when we treat human beings like animals to be caged and broken. Today, according to the Vera Institute of Justice, approximately 80,000 to 100,000 people are held in some form of restricted housing, solitary confinement, in American prisons and jails on any given day. The United Nations continues to classify prolonged solitary confinement as torture. The American Psychological Association opposes it. Medical experts say it causes permanent brain damage. Yet it continues. The Ashker settlement answered one question: is indefinite solitary confinement constitutional? The court said no. But it left another question unanswered. What do we owe the people we've already broken? Hugo Pinell spent 43 years in a concrete box. When California finally let him out, they did nothing to prepare him. Nothing to transition him. Nothing to protect him. 5 days later he was dead. That's not justice. That's not rehabilitation. That's not even basic humanity. The four gang rivals who started this revolution, Ashker, Castellanos, Dewberry, and Guillen, they proved something powerful. They proved that even in the most dehumanizing conditions, people can choose solidarity over violence, reform over revenge, hope over hatred. They were supposed to be monsters, too dangerous for human contact. Instead, they became human rights advocates. They organized 30,000 prisoners. They sued the state. They won. Pelican Bay's SHU was designed to break people, to crush their spirits, to make them disappear. But the men inside refused to disappear. They fought back with the only weapons they had: their voices, their unity, and their refusal to be treated like less than human. The experiment is over, but the consequences will last generations. If you want to see more investigations into America's most brutal prisons, watch this next video about ADX Florence, the supermax that makes Pelican Bay look like summer camp. The link is on your screen now. Thanks for watching. Don't let this story fade away.